The video game horror genre I would personally recommend to many people. Horror games are one of the only genres that can genuinely make you uncomfortable, not just get jump scared, but mentally exhausted. The best horror games stay in your head long after you stop playing them. They make you dread opening the next door, turning the next corner, or even pressing continue on the main menu. So today I'm counting down the top 10 horror games I've personally played. This list is based on atmosphere, scares, story, and gameplay. And also just how unforgettable each experience was. Some of these games terrified me, some emotionally destroyed me, and some completely changed what I thought horror games should be. Like, comment, and subscribe. I post a lot about gaming. Anyway, let's get into it. Honorable mentions is the first Outlast game. This game was great, but at the end of the day, it is really old. It came out on Xbox 360. I personally did play it. It's a great game. The next honorable mention is Alien Isolation. This game is great also, just again, like one of those games that kind of does get boring after a while. I think the gameplay loop is boring. Not a lot of people agree with me, but that's just my personal take. Chronos. Starting off this list is Chronos. This game feels like stepping into a dying world where everything around you is rotting away. The atmosphere is heavy from the very beginning, and it consistently feels like something is wrong even when nothing is happening. What makes Chronos stand out is how oppressive the environment is. A lot of horror games rely on loud noises and constant enemies, but Chronos uses isolation and mystery. The world feels ancient, cursed, and completely hopeless. Every area you explore has this decaying look to it, like civilization's collapsed a long time ago and you're just wandering through the remains. This game is very underrated and not appreciated that much. It came out, there wasn't really too much advertisement around it, so I guess that might be why, but there was not enough talk about it either. The combat is brutal too. Every enemy encounter feels dangerous because resources are limited and the enemies hit hard. You're forced to play carefully instead of running in blindly, and honestly that makes the horror stronger because every fight feels like survival. The creature designs are disturbing in a way that sticks with you. They're kind of a cosmic horror entity. They don't just look like monsters, they look wrong, twisted, unnatural, almost dreamlike. They're like part human and just like grafted together. It's super interesting. It creates this constant feeling of discomfort. Chronos isn't just trying to scare you, it tries to make you feel trapped inside a world that already is lost. And by the end of the game, you really do feel hopeless. Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 completely changed horror gaming. Even years later, this game still holds up because of how perfectly it balances horror and action. In my opinion, it's super high up on the list purely because it is mostly action. I don't really find this game that scary, but the story is great. Anyway, the opening village sequence alone is legendary. The moments you hear the chainsaw rev up for the first time, panic instantly kicks in. The enemies don't feel like mindless zombies either. They communicate, surround you, and force you to constantly move. What makes Resident Evil 4 so memorable is its pacing. 1 minute you're surviving a horrifying ambush in the village, and the next you're exploring a creepy castle filled with cult members and grotesque creatures. The game constantly changes environments and throws new horrors at you. Leon is also one of the coolest protagonists in horror gaming. He's confident, sarcastic, and somehow manages to keep going through absolute insanity. And then there's a sound design. The footsteps, the chanting, the sudden silence before chaos breaks out. It all builds tension like perfectly. Resident Evil 4 may lean more into action than pure horror, but it never loses the feeling of danger. Every encounter still feels stressful, especially on higher difficulties. It's one of the most influential horror games ever made for a reason. Ironically, I have Resident Evil 8 as number 8. Resident Evil Village takes the first-person horror of Resident Evil 7 and expands it into something bigger and more cinematic. This game feels like a nightmare fairy tale. Every section has its own unique stories, styles, and of course horror. Castle Dimitrescu feels gothic, intense, while House Viento is honestly one of the scariest sections I've ever played in any game. That baby monster scene is pure nightmare fuel. Village does a great job balancing action and horror. Ethan starts feeling more capable as the game progresses, but the enemies also become more terrifying. The werewolf-like lichens are aggressive and unpredictable, and the boss designs are absolutely insane. Visually, this game is incredible too. The snowy village, dark forest, and abandoned houses. Everything looks detailed and unsettling. It consistently feels cold and lifeless. The story also goes deeper into Ethan's story as a character, and by the ending, the game becomes surprisingly emotional. Resident Evil Village feels like multiple horror genres combined into one experience, and somehow it all works. The atmosphere of this game is great. Now we're going to start talking about some indie games. At number 7, I have Madison. Madison is one of the few horror games that genuinely made me uncomfortable while playing. This game doesn't rely on action at all. It's pure psychological terror and puzzles. The camera mechanic is what makes it unique. Taking pictures reveals hidden clues, changes environments, and sometimes reveals things you really don't want to see. Every time you pull out the camera, you're scared of what might appear in the photo. The atmosphere is relentless. The house feels alive in the worst possible way. Always change, objects move, lights flicker, and you never feel safe. What makes Madison terrifying is how unpredictable it is. The game constantly messes with your expectations. Sometimes you expect a jump scare and nothing happens. Other times the game attacks you when you least expect it. The sound design is incredible too. Whispering voices, distant noises, random banging sounds. It creates non-stop paranoia. This game feels deeply disturbing, almost like you're trapped inside someone else's nightmare. It's the kind of horror that sticks with you even after you stop playing it. Visage. Visage might honestly be one of the scariest games ever made. This game is heavily inspired by PT, and you can absolutely feel it. The house itself is basically the main villain. Every hallway feels threatening. Even standing still feels dangerous. The game creates fear out of silence and uncertainty better than almost any horror game I've played. What makes Visage terrifying is the insanity system. Staying in darkness too long affects your mind, causing hallucinations and paranormal events. You constantly feel pressured, and even when nothing is happening, it's still super stressful. The chapters are also incredible and super disturbing. Each story deals with trauma, mental illness, and tragedy in ways that feel deeply personal and unsettling. There are moments in Visage where you're genuinely don't want to continue exploring because the tension becomes unbearable. The game understands that anticipation and is scarier when the actual scare is happening. And when the scares finally happen, they hit hard. Visage doesn't just try to scare you, it psychologically drains you. Alan Wake 2. This game is phenomenal and super creative on its storytelling. I like the idea of humans having certain superpowers and stuff where it just ends up into a horror nightmare. Anyway, Alan Wake 2 feels like a playable psychological horror game and horror movie. The storytelling in the game is absolutely insane. The dark place is one of the most unique environments I've ever seen in gaming. Reality consistently shifts around you, and it feels like the world itself is collapsing under the power of Alan's writing. The atmosphere is incredible. Neon lights mixed with the darkness create this surreal nightmare feeling. Every environment feels cinematic but also deeply unsettling. Saga Anderson's section brings a more grounded detective horror vibe, while Alan's section feels like descending into madness. The game constantly switches between reality and nightmare in ways to keep you confused and tense. The enemies are terrifying because they emerge from darkness itself. Using lights as a weapon makes every encounter feel intense and desperate. What really makes Alan Wake 2 special is how artistic it feels. The live action sequences, the music, visuals, and storytelling all combine into something completely unique, and it's one of the most unique horror stories I've ever played. It's not just horror, it's psychological chaos. Dead Space. Dead Space is a survival horror perfection from the moment you step into the USG Ishimura. The game makes you feel isolated and doomed. The ship itself feels haunted. The flickering lights, broken machinery, distant screams, everything creates a non-stop tension. The necromorphs are some of the most horrifying enemies in gaming history. Their movements are unnatural and violent, and the fact that you have to strategically dismember them makes combat feel so fun and also stressful. Isaac Clarke being mostly silent actually helps the immersion. You feel alone against impossible odds. The sound design in Dead Space is legendary too. Hearing vents rattle above you immediately puts you on the edge because you know something could attack you at any moment. What makes Dead Space so effective is what it combines sci-fi with body horror perfectly. Every creature looks grotesque and painfully mutated. Even years later, Dead Space remains one of the most intense horror experiences I've ever played and honestly ever made. Resident Evil Requiem. Resident Evil Requiem feels like the series fully embracing psychological horror while keeping the cinematic style the franchise is always known for. It's like a combination of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 4. The enemy design is horrifying too. Instead of just relying on grotesque monsters, Requiem creates enemies that feel intelligent and deeply unnatural. The pacing is excellent. The game knows when to slow things down and let tension build before exploding into chaos. Visually, it's stunning. The lighting, shadows, and environmental detail make every location feel realistic and terrifying at the same time. What really stood out to me was how emotionally heavy the story felt. There's this constant feeling of dread throughout the entire experience, and then it does have kind of a good ending. Resident Evil Requiem feels like survival horror is evolving again. Resident Evil 7 brought Resident Evil back to horror, and honestly, it saved the franchise. There's no doubt I put this game at number 2 because this game is super influential. The Baker family is terrifying because they feel human. Jack Baker stalking you through the house is one of the most stressful experiences in horror gaming. He doesn't feel scripted, he feels relentless. The first-person perspective makes everything more immersive. You're not watching Ethan suffer, you are Ethan. The house itself feels disgusting and decayed. Mold covers the walls, the lighting is dim, and every room feels claustrophobic. This game also understands pacing perfectly. It slowly builds tension before throwing you into complete panic. And then there's the VR experience, which somehow makes the game even more horrifying. Resident Evil 7 stripped away the over-the-top action and returned to the pure survival horror. Limited ammo, terrifying enemies, and non-stop tension made every second feel dangerous. This reminded people why Resident Evil became iconic in the first place. Silent Hill 2. I chose this at number 1 because it's not just the best horror game I've ever played, it's one of the greatest games ever made. This game isn't scary because of monsters or jump scares, it's scary because of what it says about guilt, grief, and the human psychology. The town of Silent Hill feels cursed and empty, covered in fog like reality itself is hiding something. Every street feels lonely, every building feels wrong. James Sunderland is one of the most complex protagonists in gaming. As the story unfolds, you slowly realize this isn't just a horror game, it's a psychological breakdown. The monster's design is legendary. Pyramid Head alone became one of the most iconic horror figures ever created because he represented something deeper than just a physical threat. The soundtrack is haunting too. The music creates this emotional sadness and stays with you throughout the entire game. Silent Hill 2 doesn't just scare you, it makes you uncomfortable. Emotionally, it forces you to think about guilt, trauma, and denial. By the end, it feels less like you played a game and more like you experienced something unforgettable. And that's why Silent Hill 2 is at my number 1. So that was my personal top 10 horror games I've ever played. Let me know your list in the comments because there are still a ton of horror games I still need to play and experience. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Stick around because I've got more horror and gaming content coming soon. Anyway, enough of me talking. Have a great rest of your day.